Imagine a world in flux, a world where kingdoms clashed, economies shifted, and societies transformed. A world where the clash of swords on the battlefield echoed the clash of ideas in the streets. This was Britain from the 14th to the 15th century, a time of conflict, resilience, and rebirth. Welcome to Historical Scholia, where we unravel the threads of history to understand how the past shapes our present. In this third installment of our series on the social and economic history of Britain, we journey through one of the most tumultuous and transformative periods in British history, from the Hundred Years' War to the Wars of the Roses, and finally to the dawn of the Renaissance. This was an age of contradictions. It was a time of brutal warfare, yet also of burgeoning trade and cultural flourishing. It was an era when the feudal system began to crumble, giving way to new economic structures and social mobility. And it was a time when the seeds of the Renaissance were sown, planting the roots of modernity in the fertile soil of a changing world. From the battlefields of France to the merchant stalls of London, from the political intrigues of the royal court to the quiet revolutions in art and thought, this video will explore how conflict and change shaped Britain's destiny. So, join us as we delve into the stories of kings and peasants, merchants and soldiers, artists and thinkers, all of whom played a part in the grand tapestry of history. This is the story of how Britain emerged from the shadows of the Middle Ages and stepped into the light of the Renaissance. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video. Chapter 5: Conflict, War, and Economic Change. The Hundred Years' War, fought between England and France from 1337 to 1453, was not just a series of bloody battles and shifting alliances. It was a war that tore at the very fabric of medieval Europe. Spanning over a century, this protracted conflict would have profound economic, social, and political consequences, shaping the future of both nations and altering the course of European history. For both England and France, the war brought enormous financial strain. The cost of raising and maintaining armies, financing sieges, and supporting long-term campaigns was staggering. Both monarchies relied heavily on taxes, loans, and, increasingly, mercenaries. Soldiers paid to fight for the highest bidder. As the war dragged on, the burden of these costs fell on the shoulders of the common people. The rise of mercenaries marked a new era in warfare. These professional soldiers, motivated by pay rather than loyalty, became a fixture of the battlefield. They were costly to hire and difficult to control, but both England and France found them necessary to sustain their military efforts. However, their presence often meant devastation for civilian populations. Villages were raided, resources were plundered, and the countryside became a battleground, with no quarter given to the innocent. Beyond the battlefield, the effects of the war rippled through every corner of society. Agriculture, the lifeblood of both nations, was crippled. Fields were left untended as soldiers marched through, crops were destroyed in sieges, and entire villages were burned to the ground. With a diminished labor force and the constant threat of violence, food shortages became a reality for many. Trade, too, was severely disrupted. The war disrupted long-standing trade routes across the Channel and into the rest of Europe. Merchants found it difficult, if not impossible, to transport goods safely. Ports were blockaded, and the flow of essential goods like grain, wool, and cloth dwindled. Prices soared as scarcity took hold, and the economy of both nations began to suffer in ways that would take centuries to recover. The war's impact on daily life was felt most keenly by the lower classes. Peasants and townsfolk found themselves not only struggling to feed their families, but also forced to pay heavy taxes and provide supplies to both armies. In a society already built on inequality, the war exacerbated the hardships faced by the poor, leaving them with little hope for relief. And yet, the war also paved the way for new economic and political changes. The constant demand for resources and the growing reliance on mercenaries would eventually give rise to new economic systems, changes in the structure of military service, and even the rise of early forms of capitalism. As both England and France faced mounting costs and the collapse of traditional medieval structures, new solutions were sought, but not without significant struggle and sacrifice. The Hundred Years' War would continue to ravage Europe, but it also planted the seeds for a new era, one where the social, political, and economic order would never be the same. The echoes of this long and bloody conflict would resonate through the ages, shaping the world in ways that the medieval societies of England and France could scarcely imagine. In 1347, a silent terror spread across Europe. The Black Death, a pandemic of unprecedented scale, arrived in England, and within just a few short years, it claimed the lives of millions. What followed was not only the death of individuals, but the death of entire ways of life, leaving society irrevocably changed. As the plague swept across the land, villages and towns were decimated, fields went untended, markets stood empty, and homes lay abandoned. The economic toll was immediate and devastating. With so many dead, labor became scarce. The loss of workers, farmers, and craftsmen left a void that could not easily be filled. For those who survived, the shift in the labor force was striking. With fewer hands to work the fields and man the workshops, wages soared. No longer bound by the old feudal system, surviving peasants found themselves with newfound leverage. Landowners, desperate for workers, offered higher wages and more favorable terms. But the ripple effects of the plague were far deeper. As peasants began to demand higher wages and better living conditions, many of the long-held social structures began to unravel. The feudal system that had defined medieval life for centuries was no longer sustainable. Power dynamics shifted, and a new working class began to emerge, one less bound to the land and more willing to seek out new opportunities. In the aftermath of the plague, as the land slowly recovered, many peasants found themselves with access to land they had never owned before. Land redistribution became a reality in some areas, and for the first time, individuals were able to work independently, not as serfs, but as freeholders with the power to negotiate their futures. The effects of the Black Death went beyond economic change. The societal structure that had been in place for centuries began to weaken. The old bonds of feudalism were loosened, and with them came a sense of mobility and opportunity that had never existed before. It was a time of upheaval, but also of reinvention, as the world of medieval England began to shift into something new. The Black Death, though a catastrophe of unfathomable scale, inadvertently laid the groundwork for the social and economic transformations that would follow. It dismantled old systems, and from its ashes, a new society, with new possibilities, would slowly take shape. The Wars of the Roses, fought between the houses of Lancaster and York, marked one of the most turbulent periods in England's history. From 1455 to 1487, these dynastic conflicts over the throne would ravage the nation, leaving deep social and economic scars. Yet, in the ashes of war, England was also transformed. Its feudal system shattered, and the path to early modern England begun. Henry VI, the son of Henry V, became king as an infant in 1422, inheriting a crown weakened by political instability and ongoing conflicts. His reign, marked by bouts of mental illness, resulted in a power vacuum that set the stage for the Wars of the Roses. The wars were primarily a struggle between two factions of the royal family, the Lancasters, supporters of Henry VI, and the Yorks, who believed they had a stronger claim to the throne. Henry's inability to effectively govern and his bouts of madness left the kingdom divided, with powerful nobles like Richard, Duke of York, seeking to take control. The Wars of the Roses began in earnest during Henry's reign, with his supporters, known as the Lancastrians, fiercely defending the throne. Despite his personal struggles, Henry's role as a symbol of the Lancastrian cause made him central to the conflict. His eventual deposition and the rise of Edward IV marked a key turning point in the war, but the struggle for the throne would continue to shape England for decades. Henry's involvement in the Wars of the Roses was defined less by battlefield victories and more by his attempts to hold on to power through alliances, royal decrees, and support from his family, including his strong-willed wife, Margaret of Anjou. Lord Warwick, known as the Kingmaker, was a central figure in the Wars of the Roses, the series of English civil wars fought between the rival houses of Lancaster and York during the 15th century. Born Richard Neville in 1428, he was the eldest son of the powerful Earl of Salisbury. Through his marriage to Anne Beauchamp, he inherited vast estates, further cementing his position among the English nobility. Warwick's claim to the throne was not direct, but through his powerful alliances and his close ties to both the Yorkist and Lancastrian factions. Initially, he supported the Yorkist cause, aiding Edward IV in his rise to the throne after defeating the Lancastrian forces. However, Warwick's ambitions for greater influence led to tensions with Edward IV, especially as Warwick sought a more prominent role in the governance of England. In a dramatic turn, Warwick switched sides, allying with the Lancastrians in an attempt to restore the throne to Henry II. This betrayal of the Yorkists and his subsequent support for Margaret of Anjou marked the height of his influence, but ultimately his efforts failed, leading to his downfall. Warwick's role in the Wars of the Roses was crucial, not only in shaping the fate of the monarchy, but also in demonstrating the volatile nature of loyalty and power during this tumultuous period in English history. His actions and the shifting allegiances left a lasting impact on the course of the wars, making him one of the most memorable and influential figures of the conflict. Lord Warwick leaned over a weathered map, his finger tracing the boundaries of power across England. "We control the north," he murmured, his eyes narrowing as he studied the terrain. "But the Lancastrians hold sway in the west. If we act quickly, we can seize their strongholds, though it will come at a cost." His voice dropped slightly as he glanced up, his expression hardening. "Our coffers are low, and we may have to rely on mercenaries to bolster our ranks." His advisor, standing nearby, shifted uneasily, a frown creasing his brow. "Mercenaries are costly, my lord," he cautioned, his voice tinged with apprehension. "And what of the common folk? The land is being scorched by both sides. Crops have been burned, villages abandoned, the peasants are growing restless." Lord Warwick's gaze remained fixed on the map, his tone unyielding as he cut the advisor off. "Restless or not, the crown is ours to claim," he declared firmly. "The nobility must stand united behind us. The commoners can be controlled once the land is in our hands." As the war unfolded, it wasn't just kings and generals who suffered. The English countryside, torn apart by the constant back and forth of armies, was left in ruins. Villages were destroyed, fields were ravaged, and local economies were devastated. For the peasants, the war meant the loss of their livelihoods and their homes, with neither the Lancastrians nor the Yorkists offering much protection. Thomas, a peasant, stood with his wife at the edge of their once fertile land, his gaze sweeping over the barren fields. The remnants of a life they had fought to maintain lay in ruins. His voice, heavy with despair, broke the silence. "It's gone, Margaret," he muttered, his eyes fixed on the empty horizon. "The Lord's men took everything, the cattle, the grain, what little we had left, and they'll come back for the rest. The land is no longer ours to till. With the war raging, there's no work left, no protection. What are we to do?" Margaret stood beside him, her face lined with exhaustion, but firm with resolve. She sighed, her breath catching as she looked out across the land they had once worked together. "We have no choice but to leave," she said softly, her voice steady despite the uncertainty. "The roads to the north may still be safe. We'll join the others, find what work we can, or maybe even take up arms. But we can no longer stay here." With a final glance at the land that had once been their home, they turned away, the weight of their uncertain future pressing down on them as they began the long, uncertain journey ahead. For the common folk, the Wars of the Roses meant more than just destruction. The once stable system of feudalism began to unravel. As nobles fought for control of the throne, lands were taken, given, and lost, with little regard for the peasants who worked them. Many were left dispossessed, and with the feudal order collapsing, the old social structures began to falter. Queen Margaret of Anjou, the wife of King Henry VI, was a fierce and determined figure in the Wars of the Roses. Born in 1430 in France, she was crowned Queen of England at a young age and became a staunch defender of her husband's throne when the Yorkists challenged their rule. Known for her unyielding loyalty and strength, Margaret led the Lancastrian cause with tenacity, despite the numerous setbacks and betrayals she faced. Her role in the conflict was crucial, as she not only mobilized forces to fight, but also played a key part in the political maneuvering that defined the wars. Margaret's resilience, both on the battlefield and in the court, made her one of the most formidable figures of the conflict. With a steely resolve, Queen Margaret stepped forward, her gaze fierce and unyielding as she addressed her supporters. "We will not surrender," she declared, her voice ringing with defiance. "The throne is rightfully ours, and the Yorkists must be stopped. Our bloodline has ruled this country for decades, and we will not let them tear us apart. The land is still ours. We must fight for it." Her words, fueled by years of hardship and determination, were a call to arms, urging her followers to rally behind her and protect the crown from the encroaching Yorkist forces. Margaret's resolve was clear. No matter the cost, she would not allow the Lancastrian cause to falter. The wars were not merely about the throne, they were about control of land, power, and wealth. As families like the Yorks and Lancasters rose and fell, so too did the fortunes of the nobles and their holdings. Land ownership shifted dramatically, as those loyal to each side fought to claim what they could. Titles were won through bloodshed, and old alliances were tested in the fires of war. Edward IV, the son of Richard, Duke of York, played a pivotal role in the Wars of the Roses, emerging as one of the central figures of the conflict. Born in 1442, Edward's claim to the throne was based on his descent from the Plantagenet line, which was rivaled by the Lancastrian claim of Henry VI. His journey to the throne began in 1460, when his father, the Duke of York, was killed in battle, leaving Edward to continue the fight for the crown. Edward's military skill and charisma won him key battles, most notably the Battle of Towton in 1461, which decisively tipped the scale in favor of the Yorkists. After Henry VI was briefly deposed, Edward was crowned Edward IV. His reign marked a period of relative stability for the Yorkists, but the conflict was far from over, as Henry VI and his supporters, led by Queen Margaret of Anjou, continued to challenge his rule. Edward IV's reign would be marked by political intrigue, shifting alliances, and his own internal struggles with power. His leadership of the Yorkist cause and his eventual establishment of Yorkist control over England made him a key figure in the Wars of the Roses, and his victory paved the way for the eventual dominance of his heirs in the late 15th century. King Edward IV sat at his desk, the heavy weight of his decisions pressing upon him as he read aloud from the letter before him. His voice was steady but firm, each word carrying the authority of his reign. "By royal decree, all lands once held by the Lancastrian family are to be redistributed to the crown's loyal subjects," he read, his eyes scanning the text with determination. "This is how we rebuild our kingdom, by taking what we are owed, by taking control of the land." The advisor standing beside him bowed low, his expression cautious but respectful. "Your Majesty," he began, his voice tinged with concern, "this may cause unrest among the former Lancastrian supporters. The land is theirs by inheritance." Edward's gaze shifted to the advisor, his eyes cold and resolute. He spoke with unyielding authority, his voice carrying the weight of a monarch determined to solidify his rule. "The inheritance of traitors is forfeit," he said, his tone sharp. "We must secure loyalty through power, not bloodlines. The crown will no longer be held hostage by any family's claim to land." With a final glance at the letter, Edward set it aside, his mind already focused on the next steps in securing his kingdom. The past was to be erased, and his reign was to be built on loyalty to the crown above all else. Edward IV's rise to power marked a turning point in the war and in English history. In the aftermath of the conflict, the crown assumed greater control over land ownership and noble titles. The old feudal order, where land was distributed based on loyalty to the crown, began to shift toward a more centralized form of governance. Lords could no longer rely on their inherited estates alone. They had to pledge their allegiance to the king, who wielded power over both land and titles. The Wars of the Roses came to an end with the victory of Henry Tudor, who claimed the throne as Henry VII. His victory, solidified by marriage to Elizabeth of York, united the warring factions. But the scars of the conflict remained. The land was divided, old power structures had been dismantled, and the path to a new England had been carved. The Wars of the Roses had changed England forever. What began as a struggle for the throne had shattered old systems of power, altering the balance between king and nobility. By the end of the conflict, England had entered a new phase, one that would lay the foundation for the early modern age. Henry VII, born Henry Tudor, was the final key figure in the Wars of the Roses, a conflict that had torn England apart for decades. As the son of Margaret Beaufort and Edmund Tudor, he had a tenuous claim to the throne through his mother's side, linking him to the Lancastrian line. After spending years in exile in France during the height of the Yorkist dominance, Henry seized his opportunity in 1485, defeating Richard III, the last Yorkist king, at the Battle of Bosworth Field. With Richard III's death, Henry VII claimed the throne, marking the end of the York-Lancaster conflict. His victory not only signified the fall of the Plantagenet dynasty, but also the beginning of the Tudor era. Henry VII's reign was focused on consolidating power, rebuilding England after the wars, and uniting the warring factions through marriage. His marriage to Elizabeth of York, the daughter of Edward IV, symbolized the union of the two houses and the restoration of peace, bringing an end to the centuries of instability that had defined the Wars of the Roses. By stabilizing the monarchy and transitioning from the chaos of dynastic conflict, Henry VII laid the foundation for the rise of the Tudor dynasty, which would dominate England for over a century and usher in the early modern period. Chapter 6: The End of the Middle Ages and the Dawn of the Renaissance. As the Middle Ages drew to a close, England found itself at the crossroads of a profound transformation. The old feudal economy, based on land, labor, and loyalty, was steadily being replaced by something entirely new, a market-driven economy. The foundations of early capitalism were being laid, as trade, banking, and investment began to take center stage, reshaping the very fabric of English society. No longer were wealth and power solely determined by land ownership. In the bustling market squares of towns and cities, merchants were gaining influence, trading goods and services that transcended local boundaries. This new economy was fluid, dependent not just on what could be harvested from the land, but on the movement of goods, the investment of capital, and the flow of money. For the noble class, this shift was both an opportunity and a challenge. Lords, once powerful due to their vast estates and the labor of peasants bound to their lands, now found themselves adapting to a world where trade and money could secure as much power as a castle or manor. The old feudal structure, with its rigid hierarchies and land-based wealth, began to erode in favor of a new order, one driven by commerce and financial acumen. This was the dawn of early capitalism, the rise of merchant classes, the growth of cities, and the expansion of long-distance trade, all pointed toward a new economic paradigm. It was a world where the movement of goods, from wool to spices, from silk to grain, began to determine fortunes. Investment in trade and the accumulation of capital became the new path to power. Meanwhile, in the small workshops and textile mills, artisans and workers were experiencing their own form of transformation. Many of them, like weavers and craftsmen, were no longer tied to the land or dependent on feudal lords for their livelihoods. The opportunity to work for wages, to sell goods in increasingly interconnected markets, empowered individuals in a way that was previously unimaginable. The rise of these independent workers marked the early stages of industrialization, a process that would, in the centuries to come, fundamentally change the nature of work itself. And it wasn't just in the streets or marketplaces where the shift could be seen. In the newly emerging banks and financial institutions, the modern world was being born. Early banking practices, such as lending and the establishment of interest, began to lay the groundwork for the economic systems that would dominate the next several centuries. The flow of money, once tied to the land and royal treasuries, was now entering the hands of merchants and investors. By the end of the 15th century, the signs of a new era were clear. Feudalism, the economic system that had ruled medieval England, was giving way to a more fluid, market-based economy. Trade, investment, and emerging industries began to shape a world where power was no longer tied to land alone, but to money, goods, and the ability to harness the forces of commerce. This was the birth of the modern economic system, and it set the stage for the Renaissance, an era that would redefine art, culture, and thought, just as these economic changes were redefining society itself. In 1485, with the victory of Henry VII at the Battle of Bosworth, a new era dawned for England. The bloody Wars of the Roses came to an end, and the Tudor dynasty was born. Henry, a claimant to the throne through his mother's side, sought not only to solidify his rule, but to transform England into a strong, centralized state. The turbulent years of civil war had fractured the old feudal order, and now Henry would rebuild, politically, socially, and economically. Henry VII's reign was defined by a single driving principle: control. The power of the nobility, once decentralized and fractured, was now firmly under the monarchy's hand. His first order of business was to secure the throne, not through the old system of patronage and land grants, but by increasing royal authority and ensuring a strong financial foundation. Unlike his predecessors, who had relied on the nobles to fund their wars, Henry worked to strengthen the crown's financial position. He implemented stricter tax laws and established new customs duties on trade. He focused on improving England's economic situation, creating a royal treasury that was less dependent on the whims of the aristocracy. The merchant class began to flourish as England's trading networks expanded. Henry encouraged commerce and protected England's markets by securing peaceful relations with neighboring powers, including France and Spain. Trade routes, especially for wool and cloth, brought wealth to the crown, laying the foundation for a more market-driven economy. King Henry VII stood over a detailed map of England, his fingers tracing the outlines of the kingdom, his mind focused on the future. His voice was calm but resolute as he spoke, outlining his vision for England's recovery and prosperity. "The wealth of England lies not only in its land," he said, his eyes scanning the map, "but in its trade. We shall secure alliances with Spain, and through marriage bind the crowns together. We will no longer rely on war to fill our coffers, but on commerce, diplomacy, and unity." A counselor, standing nearby, bowed deeply in acknowledgement, his voice filled with respect. "Your Majesty, the marriage of your son to Catherine of Aragon will strengthen our ties to Spain and improve our standing in Europe." Henry's expression hardened with confidence as he straightened, his gaze fixed on the horizon of possibility. "Exactly," he replied. "Through diplomacy, we will ensure England's place on the European stage. Peace will allow us to rebuild what the war has taken from us. Let us prosper through trade, not conflict." His words marked a decisive shift in England's direction, away from the destruction of war and toward a future built on stability, alliances, and economic growth. The era of dynastic conflict was over, and under Henry's leadership, England would chart a new course. By marrying his son, Arthur, to Catherine of Aragon, daughter of Spain's powerful monarchs, Henry cemented England's growing influence in Europe. This marriage symbolized a shift. England was no longer an isolated island, but a key player in European politics. But Henry's reforms were not confined to politics and economics alone. His reign also marked a profound cultural shift. The intellectual currents of the Renaissance, flowing from Italy, began to take root in England. A thirst for knowledge and learning, influenced by humanism, began to transform England's universities, court life, and even its artistic pursuits. Henry VII's son, Prince Henry, would soon inherit a kingdom not only marked by political stability, but also by a growing intellectual and cultural revival. As scholars like Sir Thomas More and John Coley began to promote humanist thought, England's court became a center of intellectual life, setting the stage for the Renaissance to take root in England. The Tudor dynasty's influence would be felt across every facet of English society. Under Henry VII's reign, England transitioned from a fractured, war-torn kingdom into a more cohesive and prosperous nation. The groundwork was laid for a period of peace, stability, and growth, one that would ultimately bring England to the forefront of European politics, culture, and economic development. As the Tudors solidified their hold on the throne, England moved decisively toward the early modern era. The feudal system, with its decentralized power and localized control, was replaced by a stronger central government. Henry VII's careful political maneuvering, economic reforms, and diplomatic efforts marked the beginning of a new chapter for England, one where the monarchy would play a central, dominant role in shaping the future of the nation. As the Middle Ages draw to a close, England stands at the threshold of a new era. It is a time of transition, of dramatic shifts in social, political, and economic structures. The medieval world, once dominated by feudal lords, serfs, and the church, has begun to evolve, setting the stage for the rise of a modern nation. The feudal system that dominated England for centuries was beginning to crumble. Wars, like the 100 Years' War, and catastrophes such as the Black Death, had left deep scars, but they also spurred profound change. The old social structures weakened and a new order emerged, one in which commerce and trade began to play a central role. The merchant class grew in wealth and influence, while the power of the old feudal lords gradually diminished. The rise of trade and commerce, bolstered by new economic practices like capitalism, marked a defining moment in England's evolution. Land no longer stood as the sole measure of wealth. Money, goods, and markets became the new currencies of power. This new economic order not only altered the fabric of society, but also paved the way for the growing influence of cities and the working class. Meanwhile, a cultural revival, known as the Renaissance, began to sweep through Europe, and England was no exception. The rediscovery of classical philosophy, literature, and art ignited a spirit of intellectual curiosity. England, once isolated, embraced these new ideas, setting the stage for a cultural and artistic flourishing that would forever change its history. Politically, the Tudor dynasty, beginning with Henry VII, would unite a fractured kingdom and lay the foundations for a centralized monarchy. No longer would England's future be shaped solely by the whims of the nobility. Through strategic alliances, economic reforms, and political stability, the Tudors ushered in an era of growing prosperity and influence. England's role in Europe and the world was now assured. The intellectual currents of the Renaissance would continue to flow through England, influencing philosophy, science, and the arts. Figures like Sir Thomas More and William Shakespeare would emerge, carrying forward the legacy of humanism. The fusion of medieval traditions with Renaissance ideals created a unique cultural tapestry that would lay the groundwork for the modern world. Looking back at the centuries of the Middle Ages, it's clear that England's transformation was not an abrupt change, but rather a gradual process, a movement from a medieval world defined by feudal structures, religious authority, and agricultural economies to a more complex and dynamic society. It was a time of immense social upheaval, yet it was also a time of resilience, adaptation, and rebirth. The Middle Ages laid the foundation for what would become the modern world. Through centuries of conflict, plague, and change, new social structures emerged, new economies were born, and new ideas took root. The transition from the medieval period to the Renaissance wasn't just a shift in time. It was a profound reshaping of how people lived, thought, and governed. Today, as we look at the world around us, we can see the echoes of those medieval centuries. The world of kings and peasants, lords and merchants, religious authority, and intellectual curiosity laid the groundwork for the society we know now. The legacy of the Middle Ages, its struggles, its triumphs, its transformations, continues to shape us in ways both seen and unseen. From social structures to economic systems, and from political institutions to cultural revolutions, the medieval world paved the way for the modern age. The story of the Middle Ages is far from over. It continues to live on, not just in the history books, but in the very fabric of our lives today. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history. With Part 3, we've explored the social and economic forces that shape Britain's past, bringing us to the dawn of a new age. But the story doesn't end here. In our next series, we'll delve into the sweeping changes from the Renaissance to the Glorious Revolution, an era of expanding trade, rising empires, and shifting power structures that redefined society. From the bustling markets of the Elizabethan age to the financial revolutions of the 17th century, we'll uncover how everyday life was transformed in ways that still shape our world today. If you've enjoyed this documentary, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with friends who love history as much as you do. Your support helps us bring the past to life. See you in the next chapter of Britain's story.